So when we come out at the end of this road, we're gonna see Plum Island.
Lyme disease is one of those illnesses that unless you have it or you know someone who's afflicted by it, most people don't even know that much about it, other than that it's caused by a tick bite. It's been referred to as the great imitator because it mirrors many other awful medical disorders, including chronic fatigue syndrome, lupus, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, fibromyalgia, and Alzheimer's disease, just to name a few. Initially, Lyme disease causes a barrage of painful symptoms, including tiredness unrelieved by sleeping or resting, insomnia, abdominal pain, nausea, confusion, mood swings, joint pain, recurrent headaches, fever, chills, dizziness, difficulty concentrating, and even impaired short-term memory.
All along the sides of this road are some very thick woods and thick brush, and I'm just thinking how much we want to stay in the center of this path, because I'm about sick and tired of weaponized ticks.
But ultimately, it can harm organs and systems throughout the body, including the heart, the circulatory, digestive, and reproductive systems, and the brain and nervous system. Despite the fact that many people don't know that much about it, Lyme disease is becoming pretty common these days. According to the CDC, Lyme was the 6th most common nationally notifiable disease in 2015 and the most commonly reported vector-borne illness in the United States, thought to affect some 300,000 people a year in this country.
I'm from Missouri. We have a lot of ticks in Missouri, and I grew up in the woods, but it's not anything like you see here. The ticks are rampant.
Strangely, though, when people attempt to get medical attention for Lyme disease, a lot of times they're told that Lyme disease is really rare and that they probably have something else. Many times a person is forced to go through exhaustive medical testing for all kinds of other ailments and ruling all of those out before a doctor will even consider administering a test for Lyme disease. But I'll get to that later.
You could walk in there for 2 seconds, step back out here, you'll be covered in ticks. Tiny little ones that are so small you basically need to go over your body for 3 hours with a high-powered flashlight just to even find the things to get them off of yourself. It's a nightmare.
There may be a good reason why doctors are hesitant to test their patients for Lyme, even when those patients are fully willing to pay out of pocket for the testing for it, and despite the fact that for some reason in this era of modern medical technology, the test for Lyme is still woefully inaccurate. For the longest time, the government has been implicated in and repeatedly denied any ties to the creation and proliferation of Lyme disease in this country, despite some pretty compelling evidence to the contrary. Lyme disease was not officially recognized or discovered until the mid-70s when there was an outbreak of what doctors originally mistook for juvenile rheumatoid arthritis in several southeastern Connecticut towns, including Lyme and Old Lyme, which is how the disease got its name. A cursory newspaper archive search revealed that the bacteria that causes Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi, wasn't mentioned in print in newspapers until the year 1984, although Google newspapers came back with nothing at all. If you look at these towns on a map, you'll notice they are right directly across the Long Island Sound from Plum Island, which has been a government animal disease research facility since the mid-50s and doubled as a military biological warfare research facility, although the government denied it for decades. It's less than 9 miles from shore to shore, the way the crow flies.
Well, we're looking generally at the coast of Connecticut, where Old Lyme is located, just a short distance really across the Sound.
You'll also notice if you look again at those maps I showed earlier, the outbreak and concentration of Lyme disease in this country centers around that place. The CDC admits that 95% of cases of Lyme come from just 14 states, the majority of which are located around Plum Island. Plum Island's biowarfare history dates back to World War II and Operation Paperclip, a top-secret government program to shield Nazi scientists from trial or punishment by quietly bringing them over to the U.S. and giving them new identities and U.S. citizenship in exchange for working for the government and military. One such Nazi scientist was Dr. Erich Traub, lab chief during World War II for Nazi Germany's Insel Reims, a secret biological warfare laboratory on an island in the Baltic Sea where Traub worked directly under Hitler's number 2, Heinrich Himmler. Traub's job included spraying viruses from planes over occupied Russia. Prior to the war, just by the way, Traub had been involved in Nazi activities in the U.S. at Camp Siegfried on Long Island, just 30 miles from where Plum Island would eventually be located, while he was here on a fellowship studying viruses and bacteria at, of all places, the Rockefeller Institute. Plum Island was specifically named for Cold War biowarfare research alongside Dugway Proving Ground and Fort Detrick back in the early 50s, when the U.S. biowarfare program and clandestine germ warfare trials first began. Eric Traub completed his Operation Paperclip duties working for the American Biological Warfare Program from 1949 to 1953, during which time he consulted with the CIA and scientists at Fort Detrick before returning to West Germany in 1953 to run the country's own Inselreams-like experimental virus facility in Tübingen with the U.S. government's permission. Not only did USDA officials visit Traub's lab over there, but Traub also briefly worked for the USDA, which oversaw Plum Island, and throughout the 50s he was in regular contact with Plum Island's director, Doc Shahan. He was also at the Plum Island dedication ceremony in 1956 and visited the place at least twice after that in 57 and 58 when Plum Island's lead scientist, Dr. Jacob Traum, retired, and the USDA considered replacing him with who else? Dr. Eric Traub. Seems like they got the location idea for Plum Island from Inselreams. Can't imagine who gave it to him. In the 1970s, attorney John Loftus was hired by the Office of Special Investigations, a unit set up by the Justice Department to look into Nazi war crimes. He was given a top-secret clearance and allowed access to decades' worth of classified documents. Loftus turned up records of Nazi germ warfare scientists who came into the U.S. and experimented with dropping poison ticks from planes to spread rare diseases. He also specifically mentioned in his book, The Belarus Secret, that he received information that suggested the U.S. tested some of these poison ticks on the Plum Island Artillery Range during the early 1950s when it was called Fort Terry. This story was further validated by attorney Michael Carroll in his book Lab 257. Carroll claims that not only did a source who worked at Plum Island in the 50s tell him that some of the workers purposefully released ticks outdoors on the island in 1951, and that they all referred to one of the scientists involved as, quote, the Nazi scientist, but Carroll says he dug up a box of 1950s USDA files from the National Archives vault that included 3 folders, 2 labeled Tick Research and 1 labeled E. Traub. All 3 were empty. Even more damning, in an article in the Journal of Degenerative Diseases, Marjorie Tetchin reported that 60% of chronic Lyme patients are actually co-infected with several strains of mycoplasma, the most common one being Mycoplasma fermentans, which just so happens to be patented by the U.S. Army and Army pathologist Dr. Lowe. Today, the official story touted by government scientists is that the scientific evidence does not support Lyme disease originating on Plum Island. This is despite the fact that researchers at Plum Island were experimenting with hundreds of thousands of hard and soft ticks on Plum Island, where classified top-secret biowarfare research was being carried out by the U.S. military for decades, and that the first outbreak of Lyme happened right directly across the Sound from Plum Island, where thousands upon thousands of birds fly, and despite the fact that they've been forced to admit culpability in the outbreak of other types of viruses on the island due to the unsecured nature of these experiments, especially in the early decades. Experimental animals for which being kept outside in open-air pens up through the late 70s, when a highly contagious foot and mouth disease outbreak on Plum Island in 1978 ended in the government being forced to put over 200 of its own animals to death. The U.S. government continues to pretend like it couldn't possibly have had a hand in Lyme disease. Then again, the U.S. government has repeatedly denied that there was even any biowarfare experimentation going on Plum Island for decades, up until documents proving otherwise were published by Newsday in 1993. Meanwhile, Canada's been complaining in recent years of Lyme disease proliferating there due to migratory birds picking up black-legged ticks when they fly south into the U.S. for the winter and come back up there with them. Of course, I guess it would be a PR lawsuit nightmare if they did have to admit any culpability of this after decades upon decades of Americans suffering and probably dying from Lyme, which they would obviously avoid at all costs in the interest of national security. Earlier, I mentioned that it's believed Lyme disease affects some 300,000 people annually in this country, but that number is basically meaningless because people are forced to go through a medical merry-go-round just to be able to get tested for Lyme disease in the first place. And then, as Tetchin points out, many are only treated for it for a month on antibiotics, and according to prestigious Yale University, which has only been implicated in government dirty work for decades with Plum Island right in its own backyard, If the person still has Lyme disease symptoms on the 31st day of antibiotic treatment, they're labeled as having something else, whatever affliction the disease has mimicked in their body. In this way, if they die of something else in the official medical record and in the statistics, not Lyme disease, and they no longer get counted in the Lyme disease statistics. And that's after the patient goes through the rigmarole to even be able to get tested in the first place. My mother went through this when she lived in Missouri and was bitten by a tick and later found the telltale bullseye rash. Her doctor straight up told her Lyme disease does not exist in Missouri, and it wasn't possible for a Missourian to get it, and that it was all in her head, and even went so far as writing in her medical chart that the patient is convinced she has Lyme disease even though her doctor apprised her of the quote-unquote facts. She ended up having to go to a different doctor and plead her case to him and essentially argue her way into even being allowed to get the test to begin with. This right here is how statistics continue to be toyed with even to this day in order to cover up an epidemic that is linked to government biowarfare research. If you've ever been to Long Island, you see the signs everywhere in parks warning you about ticks and Lyme disease. That place is absolutely infested with them. Decades of animal disease research and burying the wastes of that research on Plum Island itself has left the entire place an environmental disaster. And according to Carol, repeated attempts to decontaminate the crumbling unsecure Lab 257 failed, and they finally had to build a whole new building on the island. But the thing is such a mess that USDA and DHS, who jointly run Plum Island, started asking about moving it in the last decade. And you'll never guess where they decided to move the Plum Island Animal Disease Research Facility to.
Very creepy stuff. And yet somehow they find a way to make it even creepier than Nazi-connected bio-research agents, because they're about to move Plum Island, or have already started, to move it to Manhattan, Kansas, in the middle of cattle and GMO crop country.
And Tornado Alley.
And Tornado Alley. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, how about everything?
Manhattan, Kansas. Basically right smack dab in the middle of the country. That's right. As Congressman Michael Burgess pointed out at a September 2009 Oversight and Investigations hearing on federal oversight of high containment biolaboratories held before the Committee on Energy and Commerce, which was held a week after, by the way, the vote on the House resolution to move the Plum Island facility to Kansas, quote, "The language of the resolution proudly touted that 45% of the fed cattle in the United States and 40% of the hogs produced in this country are in Kansas. Considering that hoof and mouth disease, which is the primary research being done at Plum Island, is a disease which can spread with devastating swiftness from humans to cattle and hogs, shouldn't we have done our O&I hearing on the scientific evaluations being done at DHS before we voted on a resolution saying that Kansas was the best pick? Gee, you think?"
Yeah, a lot of people would probably say, so what, no big deal to Island of Dr. Moreau. Just a little genetic engineering, little mutants, little hybrid.
Few diseases.
Little animal cells in our human DNA, little diseases here and there. Yeah, no big deal.
Mm-hmm.